Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining myself and Peter Conti-Brown this afternoon. I know it's late Friday, but Peter is a man of international travel and intrigue. We were lucky to get him. He just flew back from Asia, an amazing trip there, and he's probably a little bit tired, but he's taking time out of his busy schedule to chat with us about the essay that he wrote for us on my Substack, as well as his, on three potential paths for a new Fed-Treasury accord. Peter, welcome back.
Delighted to be here with you, David. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on, and I'm looking forward to discussing your essay. And I think it's a very important and interesting essay. But before we do that, Peter, this week, some very interesting developments happened. There's a lot of course, interesting developments. We've got a war in the Middle East. We have inflation, looks like it's going up. Terrible job report today. But earlier in the week, there was a conference or a symposium where Governor Michelle Bowman spoke, as well as Treasury Secretary Bessent. And they both said similar things. They both brought up questions about liquidity regulations and how useful they are, or how should they be reformed in light of 15 plus years of evidence since the Great Recession. And they also brought up the discount window and how these two things interact. And one of the things that was highlighted, which is something that was pushed in the previous administration, so I was delighted to see them talk about this and see the interest in it, is counting collateral parked at the discount window toward the liquidity coverage ratio or internal liquidity stress tests. Just a kind of a thinking, let's keep this conversation going. So I was excited to see that they're still interested in that. What was your response to that development?
Well, funny enough, I was supposed to be at that conference, but I was in Singapore, so couldn't make it. It follows on a conversation that was hosted by the same group. I want to say 2 years ago in the previous administration, and the enthusiasm for revisiting assumptions about why discount window lending is stigmatized. It was pretty sky high in 2024 when that convened, and then it sort of went away. It seemed like it receded in importance. The new Vice Chair Bowman taking over after Vice Chair Barr. There were just a list of things that they wanted to change, large and small, was very long, and so I was a little bit worried that liquidity reform would fall off the table. So coming back from Singapore, I haven't read both speeches. I only saw the news coverage, but it made me pretty excited. I've had these, I've had views about reforming the discount window for a long time. I wrote a paper, as you'll recall, I was on Macro Musings to talk about this, about using more discount window facilities for targeted lending to keep the Fed out of credit policy, but get banks more into it. And so I think that there's so much more room for discount window lending. What I'm gathering from these speeches, and I'll write about this next week on my Substack after I've had a chance to digest them, is really a confrontation with what policy did to stigmatize discount window lending. And there are some changes that we want to make, and you make in the natural order of things where there's wide technocratic consensus. And I used to think that discount window reform was that. Like, everybody agrees, why don't we do this? But here's the other side of the argument. And I think a markets guy like you, David, will appreciate this. I consider myself a markets person too. And so the idea is discount window lending should be stigmatized because it's a market alternative that is subsidized by the taxpayer. How? Well, it's subsidized through seigniorage. The taxpayers through seigniorage are paying the salaries, literally, of the bank officers on the other side of that lending decision. The lending is made not exclusively for the benefit of the shareholders of the entity, here the Federal Reserve banks, but for some sort of policy reason. So it's a government policy injecting liquidity for some purpose. And what's that purpose? Well, financial stability. But who's the recipient of it? Private banks. So if you're someone who's thinking, listen, we want a Fed to be able to lend to all. We want a Fed that will be able to take on all kinds of projects. We want a Fed that uses the power of the purse through seigniorage to accomplish all kinds of goods. Then maybe you won't be as troubled with discount window lending, but you'll want it to expand a lot further. And if you're someone who thinks, no, the government shouldn't be doing any of this sort of stuff. If a bank needs some to borrow in a period of intermediate stress, then it should go find some lenders, right? and
Yeah.
we shouldn't have the government involved in it. We used to have a market like that. It's called the federal funds market. But that doesn't really exist anymore. And so the criticism of the discount window, which the Fed basically incorporated through most of its history, is if you're coming to the discount window, there's something wrong with you. There's something you have
Mhm.
not been doing well. And why should we reward bad behavior? We have a name for that too. It's called moral hazard.
Yeah.
So I think I'm not persuaded by this. I want to be clear. I think that counting and for our listeners who are new to this debate, the idea basically is to dramatically expand the way that we treat for liquidity coverage ratio purposes and liquidity regulation generally, is to permit banks to count the collateral that they have parked at the Fed, which cannot be encumbered with any other lending or lien attached to it. It's got to be fully devoted for that purpose only. And rather than having that just be inert at the discount window, that gets to offset liquidity coverage ratios so you can do other things. You don't have to double count it. You don't have to have more
Yeah.
liquidity in other places. And I'm in favor of that reform. But we should be clear-eyed about the fact that it is a very specific endorsement of a bank subsidized system through the Federal Reserve.
Definitely, and I've had that comment made at me, David. How can you be endorsing this? You're just piling on more moral hazard. And to me, it's a fair comment, but it's a question of trade offs, right? So, the Fed also has a very large footprint in its current system as well, right? It's heavily involved in repo and treasury markets, and there is, as you mentioned, no interbank overnight unsecured lending market. The federal funds market is a shell of its former self, in part because of the system we currently have.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of moving pieces, and this would, in my view, be just one of many. And there'd be some trade-offs, certainly, but it's a trade-off I'm willing to make. Secretary Bessent mentioned this. The liquidity regulations are themselves contributing to the stigma of the discount window because supervisors, banks think they got to hold like the LCR 30 days of liquidity to cover any outruns. But they become so dependent upon that, and they don't want to use that it makes them even more reluctant to go to the discount window. Because if they have to go to the discount window, what happened to the liquidity buffer they were supposed to have?
Yeah.
And then ample reserves. If you have so many ample reserves, why would you need to go to the discount window as well? So that the stigma is being increased because of the current regulations and regime. So, in my view, and we don't have time for this. We're not here to talk about this today, but there are a lot of pieces I think it would need to make changes to move around. A lot of levers to pull, Peter. I think, in addition to this particular proposal.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really for it. I think it's a conversation that, nerds like us have been having for the last, I think you and I first started talking about the discount window in 2020 during the pandemic when we were, I remember, it was our first Zoom meeting and I did like do you remember this? I did the goofiest cover of a Pink Floyd song.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I still have that video for those who want to
Yeah,
see
yeah.
it.
You all should go. Maybe you shouldn't look at it. It's pretty embarrassing. But I was talking about liquidity. It was all about liquidity lending at 13.3, and
Yeah, that's right.
we
That's
should.
right.
Why can't we have a better discount window system that has something that doesn't? We don't have to
Right.
go break the glass every time. That turned out to be wrong. I think 2020 was actually
Yeah.
of breaking that glass, but boy, 2023 was not. And I think we could have done a lot better crisis management in 2023 if we had had, a really nice air traffic control system through the discount window.
Mm,
Because what we had instead was a total traffic jam. And
yeah.
and for people who say, no, we shouldn't reform the discount window, we need banks to be able to fund themselves without it. You've got to ask the next question, which is, well, where are they funding themselves now? And the answer is the Federal Home Loan banks. That's not better
Mhm.
than Fed. It's worse. It's the same as the Fed in an important sense. I mean, these are congressionally chartered
Yeah.
entities that enjoy an implicit subsidy, but they're worse because they're also not the regulators, they're not the supervisors. And so
Mhm.
having a Fed supervision system that is linked with the discount window, I think is a really powerful system, and I agree it's extremely tricky to get this right. If you've got a bank, there's some people like Bill Nelson who think that, you know, a bank that constantly uses the discount window for any kind of liquidity purposes, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think this is his view. Who cares? There should be they pay for it, right? It's an interest rate. There should be no questions asked about that. Are you there? Are you at that point where you think, like, if you're a bank that decides, "I'm not gonna use the Fed, I'm not gonna use
Yeah.
counterparties, I'm not gonna use markets, I'm not gonna use anything, I'm just going to use the discount window all the time to meet all of my liquidity needs." Is there anything wrong with that?
Yes. However, I would frame it a little bit differently. Do you want me to tell you how I would look at it?
Yeah,
Um, well, let me step back, maybe paint the context here. If we look around at other central banks in the world, advanced economy central banks, they're all moving to this so-called demand-driven operating system. And one of the reasons I think they're on this journey already and we're not is most of them have very business as usual or functional ceiling facilities. So the equivalent of a discount window. It might be a repo facility, but it's the same idea. You go to the Fed and banks are comfortable going to them. And because of that, they don't demand as many reserves. And because of that, they're able to shrink their balance sheet. And finally, because of that, almost all of them have said they want to do this in order to resurrect that interbank market. They want that missing market to reappear, to have price discovery. So they want banks to feel comfortable going to the ceiling facility, the equivalent of a discount window, if push comes to shove. And sometimes they have multiple, levels of it. But they also want banks to lend to each other. So
yeah,
I think like the ECB, the Bank of England, RB, they've all said this. They first want to regenerate that interbank market, but to do that, you've got to, again, I think fundamentally get away from the system we have now. And that's a long conversation that we haven't had in the U.S. But the ECB, they had like a whole year review. The RBA's had a long review. I think the Bank of England as well.
yeah,
So I would say this, Peter, yes and no to your question. I want banks to be able to treat it as business as usual, like they do in other places, but also just having that expectation that they can do it makes them comfortable going to other banks and not having to sit on all this demand. Again, it's a trade-off.
yeah,
It's the possibility of higher moral hazard, sure. But also the flip side is we have these big balance sheets at central banks that put the thumb on the scale in the financial system in other directions. So, I guess I've tried to thumb on the scale with a big balance sheet. I just want to see what the other potentially bad outcome could look like. Hopefully, it'd be a good outcome.
yeah. I think you and I are probably in the same place. Um, I I love the idea of resurrecting market discipline between banks, and
Yeah.
there's just no world where that comes back on an ample reserve framework. So
Yeah.
we'd have to reimagine the monetary policy
Right.
game that we have in place now.
And that's a nice segue into your essay. Let's use that because that is one possibility that you've sort of outlined here. So you had a great essay, Peter, on three possible Treasury Fed reforms, or is it Fed Treasury reforms? I guess I'll let you, the historian, pick the right framing there. But before we do that, let me just kick it off with kind of your opening salvo. You say the Fed has never had a year like 2025 politically. So tee that baby off. What are you talking about, and how does it motivate this essay?
There have been a few instances in the Fed's history where it's been on the front pages because it's been the target of political ire from the president. And remember, the president's I think one of the most important powers of the US presidency is the ability to set the agenda for everybody who talks about politics. If
Mhm.
Donald Trump is wants to talk about Iran, then we're gonna talk about Iran. I'm sure we're gonna talk about that today. Now, you and I are not Iran experts, but now we are forced to become, in a small way,
Yeah,
Iran experts because we have to think
yeah,
about, "Hey, what does this mean for the Fed?" And I'm sure you're like me, I've had that question, aimed at me, many times this week, and I've had to get smarter about it. Why? Well, because Donald Trump started this fight, this war in Iran, and now the rest of us are talking about it. So when Donald Trump sets his fight against the Fed, well, you and I talk about the Fed all the time, but then everybody else does too. And we have never seen a president put the Federal Reserve as a such a primary topic of conversation as we have seen in 2025. Closest analog we might have is 1972 when Richard Nixon did this a little bit, but mostly playfully with Arthur Burns. Behind the scenes, it was a different story. There was a lot of pressure happening. Um, another the best time that I link in the essay would have been 1950 into 1951. So Q4 1950, Q1 1951. And there, Harry Truman, a little bit proactively, but often reactively, to a cabal inside the Fed that was trying to subvert Truman's policy of Truman's debt policy. That then spilled into the front pages, and that was really the last time that we saw something like this. And I got to tell you, Donald Trump is so much more aggressive than Harry Truman. So the Fed has never had a year like 2025 because we've never had a president like Donald Trump 2.0 using the power of the presidency, including criminal investigations and
Yeah.
legal actions and threats of legal actions, the way that Donald Trump has. It's unprecedented in the Fed's history.
Yeah, I was speaking to someone who's just left the board of governors as a staff economist. He was fairly senior, and he was telling me that morale was quite low right now at least at the board where he worked. I don't know about the regional banks, but just a lot of things happening, right? A lot of developments. I think maybe you could all trace, and the common denominator would be the administration right now. But nonetheless, the Fed's moving forward. And Peter, again, before we jump into your potential three paths here, I'm just thinking, it's Trump. Well, he will at some point no longer be president. Like there's a midterm this year that could change things. Um, and sometimes going through trial and adversity makes you stronger, right? I mean, so one possibility, and this is not at all what we're talking about in your essay, but one possibility is the Fed loses independence. But could you foresee another path where the Fed actually gets more independence? Their spines stiffen. They think of clever ways to work around the president. And so, in other words, we actually grow a new institutional armor because of this experience and are more independent.
That's an interesting idea. I'm certainly open to it. In political science, we call this a version of this institutional layering. So each time you go through some sort of crisis or some sort of experience or some sort of legislative round or presidency, you build new institutions on top of the old
Hmm.
ones. And institutions here doesn't mean like organizations. We're not going to get a new central bank, but a new understanding, a new system, a new kind of norms
Yeah.
around what is constituted there. And this gets into my essay, the three kinds of Fed-Treasury accords, because the biggest thing that I could see coming out of the Trump presidency would be, I imagine the Republican primary is going to be incredibly fascinating because you're going to have basically, because of Donald Trump's control for the last 10 to 12 years, and by 2028 it'd be 12 to 14 years of the Republican Party. There are few Republicans, if there are any, who are untainted by that association. And so what you're going to have is degrees of association with Donald Trump, and you're going to start to see more more efforts for some to separate themselves from Donald Trump and others to further associate themselves from Donald Trump. Now, if Donald Trump Jr. is running or J.D. Vance running, that's impossible. They are in the image of Donald Trump. But there will be others who come in with regrets. And in that primary, you're going to hear people talk about the Fed. And they're going to
Mhm.
say things like, Donald Trump didn't go far enough. The Fed is our enemy. We need to end the Fed. We need, to do this or to do that. And that's going to appeal to a very, very, very tiny subset of even the MAGA coalition. But you're going to hear other people who are going to be creating new norms saying, this was an error. We want an
Yeah.
independent Fed. The Democrats are going to be all in for an independent Fed because it's easy to criticize Donald Trump for veering off course. And
Right.
so I think the 2028 campaign is going to be interesting because you're going to hear a lot of politicians making that declaration. And I view that as one kind of accord.
Mhm.
Notice accord's kind of the wrong word here because it's not a compromise between two parties. It's
Yeah.
a unilateral withdrawal. And that's what we need right now from Donald Trump. We need a unilateral withdrawal because what Donald Trump has done is launch this smear campaign to delegitimize the central bank. And it hasn't worked for most people. It hasn't worked for markets by and large, but it has worked for some. And when you have people who become skeptical about the Fed for reasons for which they should not be skeptical, simply because Donald Trump has set that agenda, that's a problem. And so I think we could see a Fed that is stronger emerging from this if we get politicians who repudiate the
Mhm.
use of law and criminal investigations and smear campaigns as a mechanism of trying to hold the Fed accountable.
Okay. Well, time will tell, and we'll have to revisit this possibility maybe in a few years. Um, but let's jump into your essay. You alluded to one of the possible paths, but before we go back to these three paths, maybe paint the picture historically. What was the original Fed-Treasury accord in 1951, and was it really everything we kind of built it up to be? There's a lot of hype. It's almost like this Moses coming down from Mount Sinai moment of Ten Commandments. It's a holy period in the Fed's history, but is it really that holy? I mean, what did it actually accomplish?
Yeah, I was just revising these chapters. So for readers who are for listeners who don't know this, I'm in the end stages of finishing kind of my magnum opus, which is a political history of the Fed, and I have it's 50 chapters long, and it covers all of the the full history plus a little bit of the backstory before it. And so I have to move very, very quickly through it. And this is the only topic that gets two chapters is the Fed Treasury Accord. And I break it across two chapters. Um, I don't think that our understanding of the Fed Treasury Accord, like you just described, you nailed it. That's how we view it, as this like iconic moment, few moments as important in the Fed's history. And it was no such thing. I mean, it was a period, it was a break unquestionably from what came before. But from the moment this quote unquote accord was struck, there was dispute about what it even meant. And what it didn't include enough of was enough repudiation of the Fed's interventions in politics, which were incredibly powerful. I mean, Mariner Eccles gave a speech during this whole period of the Fed of the debate, where he just launched into an attack on Harry Truman's Cold War policy. It was a big public talk. I mean, if you could imagine Michael Barr going to the Economic Club of New York and just ripping apart Donald Trump for what's happening in Iran,
Wow. Yeah,
right?
that would be huge.
It would be huge. It would be headline making, and I would probably
Yeah.
agree with Michael Barr's take on Iran, but I would launch a million
Uh,
Substacks saying, "What are you doing? You need to stop
mm,
talking because this is not your lane." But that was Mariner Eccles. He was very political in this moment. And so when we talk about the Fed Treasury Accord, we focus on this compromise, and the compromise itself is really important. It was this movement away from the World War II era peg system, where the Fed committed itself to buying, or mostly buying, was originally buying or selling, but buying all the government debt that it could gobble up to keep interest rates at a nominal peg, irrespective of the consequences for inflation, which everybody at the Fed understood was really, really bad. And this was true from the beginning. So you have in the discussions, even in 1940, in 1942. So this is in the heat of the war. People are saying, we have got to get out of this. This is really bad. We're going to cause hyperinflation in the midst of this war. Um,
huh,
but they wouldn't. They said, no, this is our commitment. We've got to support
mm,
country in war. And Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, said, "Oh, this isn't going to cause inflation. This is no problem. But don't you dare let this go up by a single basis point." Right. So
mhm.
Eccles described his relationship with the Fed, or sorry, with the Fed's relationship with the Treasury during World War II, as the Treasury makes policy and we carry it out, and that was it. And Eccles wanted out of that system. He was Fed chair at the time. As soon as the war was over, and even before the war was over, in that critical period, as the Nazi system was falling apart in the first quarter of 1945, um, he was starting to make speeches saying, "We need to end this," and it didn't. It didn't take. And President Roosevelt dies just a few weeks before Victory in Europe is secured in May. He dies in April. Victory in Europe is in May. And then, of course, the war extends till August with the atomic bombs in Japan. And then we almost immediately pivot into the Cold War and the Civil War in China, and then eventually the Korean War. And Eccles and Thomas McCabe, who succeeds Eccles as Fed chair when Harry Truman refuses to renominate Eccles, and then Alan Sproul, the president of the New York Fed, they come together and say, we need a declaration of independence. We need to get out of this. And they just went to war with Harry Truman and John Snyder, the Secretary of Treasury, in the pages of the New York Times. Strategic leaks, the only time the FOMC had a meeting at the Oval Office in its history. So it was a very dramatic time in the Fed's history. And they emerged from it with an agreement that Eccles would resign, Thomas McCabe would resign. The new Fed chair was going to be a Treasury man, William McChesney Martin, who was the Assistant Secretary for Monetary Affairs, which is a former post. Now we call that domestic finance, but it was called Monetary Affairs at the time. And they issued a statement. It was one sentence long and said, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve System have come to an accord that they will meet the demands to assure that an orderly market for government securities while avoiding the monetization of the public debt. So that's almost a verbatim quote of the original accord. But what does that mean? Well, nobody knew, and they had congressional hearings immediately thereafter to say, well, what does this mean? And John Snyder said one thing, and William McChesney Martin said another. But what happened functionally, the reason why I think that the 51 Accord is important for us to talk about is after that, mostly because the Eisenhower administration saw how badly the Truman administration had suffered politically for imposing its will on the Fed, Eisenhower just said, we're not going to fuss with the Fed. The Fed will be independent. And there was a recession where his Treasury Secretary, George Humphrey, was wanting to agitate for more control over the Fed, and Eisenhower backed off. You asked a short question. I gave a really long answer, but
No, it's
I was just reminded.
a couple of thoughts just come to mind. If I forget them, if I could go through them. But Peter, is this the first example of an independent central bank, or have there been others that were like independent from public finance before then?
Well, the Bank of England was independence is really hard. It's a hard idea to historicize because what we mean by it now is very different from how it was practiced. But in the sense that did a central bank have the ability to set to basically provide levels of credit independent of the short-term political needs of the head of state or of the prime minister? And then the Bank of England is the original independent central bank.
Okay.
But the Bank of England was also subject to constraints that the Fed did not have, which was the classical gold standard, and the which Walter Bagehot called the cast iron system. He was just like a central bank does not have that much freedom of movement, and the other is what came to be called in the 20th century the real bills doctrine, but it was in the 19th century and before that was just called the commercial bills or commercial finance doctrine, which is just the idea that the collateral that was presented to the Bank of England and other central banks had to be quote unquote good, which meant it was backwards looking, that it was to finance deals that had already been struck. And so that's what we came to call real bills.
Real bills, yeah.
As opposed to speculative finance. Now that died mostly for economic reasons because money is fungible, and the difference between deals that a deal that has already been struck and the next deal thereafter between the same parties is nothing. And so that stopped making sense in terms of a mechanism to discipline how much lending occurred. But they took it extremely seriously in the 19th century. And so that makes it so that even though the Bank of England was independent of the UK Parliament, it wasn't doing monetary policy anything like what the Fed does today. And the Federal Reserve System, as it was reformed in 1935, did create the first independent central banker in the Fed chair that was independent both of politics, but also independent of bankers. And
Mm,
that was new in the United
that
States.
was new. Okay. Well, the other comment before we, I promise we'll get to jump into the heart of the essay, but the other comment here is it's kind of reassuring to hear you say that this initial accord, it happened after this huge run up in public debt, as you know, something I've been concerned about in the US, you are too. So they had that, to face off against fiscal pressures, existing fiscal pressures. And then on top of that, soon after they have this accord, we're fighting, there's several wars going on, several big, national issues. I mean, the Korean War for the US, but you mentioned there's a Chinese Civil War. You have all these things that can rattle markets and cause, different challenges. And despite all these things, it persisted, right? So if there is going to be an accord, in the next few months, the next year or two, it's not impossible to get through all the challenges we're now facing. Just, there is a war in the Middle East, so that might give us pause. Or there's huge primary deficits, forecasted as far as the eye can see. And this, at least historical story, I think, suggests that one can still navigate through those if we do it thoughtfully.
I think that's right. And I mean, it's the parallels between 1951 and today are pretty remarkable. We are in a period of war again, but it's not a war that the administration will call a war, and that's exactly how the Truman administration regarded what we did in Korea. It was called a police action. They wouldn't. They refused to call it the Korean War was something that Republicans called it because Truman didn't want he didn't want it to be World War III.
Right, right.
Um, and the debt issue is fascinating too. Eisenhower runs on a commitment of fiscal rectitude, and this is one of the few really strong political convictions that Eisenhower had. I mean, he was a Democrat and was recruited by the Democrats to run on their ticket in 1952. Um, so he was a Republican. He was recruited to be a Democrat, but nobody knew what his party affiliation was because he was a lifelong military man. He had not.
Mm.
He. I think he cast his first vote for Franklin Roosevelt. I should look that up, but I remember he was just not a political person. But he had very strong views about balancing the budget and was really focused on this because he felt like the debt load coming out of World War II and continued in the rearmaments of the Cold War were devastating. So here we are, fast forward, whatever fears that we had about public debt then, are much worse now because the debt level relative to GDP is much higher. Um, and that leaves us in a situation where the Fed's freedom to maneuver is quite hemmed in. I think that the best way this resolves and what the Fed is hoping for is a continued immaculate disinflation. If we can get inflation back closer to target or to a place at least where they're comfortable saying this is the new target, um, and unemployment goes up, then interest rates will fall and Trump will leave them alone.
Yeah.
And then we'll have a new president who maybe will rage against the machine inside the Oval Office as interest rates go up, but won't do so, using threats of criminal peril to central bankers who raise rates. That would be the best outcome from the Fed's perspective, because then it could give Trump what he wants, but for reasons of macroeconomic necessity. The worst nightmare for the Fed will be if unemployment stays below 5%, but it looks pretty soft, but inflation starts to rise even further. And then the consensus view for macroeconomists and for central bankers is interest rates need to rise. And especially if market rates are starting to rise. So basically, the
Yeah.
markets are starting to call the Fed's bluff and say, we are less sure that the Fed is going to be able to control this. And so we start seeing, the long long maturity uh, securities start to go up. And if those start to go up, by a lot, what is the 30? What are the 10-year treasuries and 30-year treasuries at right now? Are they 4%?
10 years just above 4%. So it's remarkably low. And I'm not sure where the 30 years at, but the 10 years, I think, really low.
If 10 goes to 5 or above, then the Fed and unemployment stays below 5%, and the Fed is going to have to be in a position where they're
Yeah.
raise rates. And if Donald Trump is president, then the politics of this look really, really nasty. And so if Kevin Warsh is Fed chair and he pretzels himself into saying something, 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 AI, something, 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 maybe we can lower rates, even though the 10 years at 5 and unemployment is still low and inflation's at 3, then that would be a credibility disaster for the Fed too. So that's a world where it would be extremely difficult. In order for us to get to a 1951 kind of situation again, what we would need is really strong, politically savvy leadership from the Board of Governors primarily. Some from the FOMC more broadly, the Reserve Bank presidents, but mostly from the Board of Governors and not the chair alone. And of course, the last analogy that you could draw is the only time in the Fed's history when a former chair stayed on for anything other than just kind of a ceremonial transition was Mariner Eccles from 1948 to 1951.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
And so if will Powell do the same thing? I have some thoughts about that too, but that would be an analog.
All right. Well, again, something else to pay attention to and see how this all unfolds. So the reason we're talking about it, and all of you folks out there watching are dying to hear, is that Kevin Warsh, who's likely to be the next Fed chair, he's been nominated and presumably will be confirmed by the Senate. He has talked about a new accord between the Fed and Treasury, and we're not sure what that means, but Peter has outlined 3 possible paths. So tell us about those paths, Peter.
Yeah, I was struck by the call for a new accord because and I'm pretty skeptical of this, to be frank, because of the 3 different reasons why we would need an accord. So people talk about an accord just generically. We need a Fed Treasury accord. Basically, like something's not going right. We need to have a new understanding. And the reason I wrote this essay was because I wanted to say, well, why would we ever need a new understanding between the Fed and the Treasury? And there are 3 different reasons. They're all different, and they would require a really different kind of negotiation or a unilateral disarmament. So the first would be we need a Fed Treasury accord because, like in 1951, the Treasury has dominated the Fed. The Fed has become subordinated to the Treasury. So is that what we need? Well, yes and no right now. Yes, in the sense that Donald Trump needs to unilaterally withdraw his smear campaign against the Fed. But when Kevin Warsh says we need a new accord, I don't think that he means because Donald Trump needs to knock all this garbage off, right? Yeah, and so that part makes me a little bit uncomfortable because there's a vibe of calling for a new accord in the midst of this smear campaign of like, look what you made me do. A bully comes in, punches you in the nose, steals your lunch money, and says, "We need to have an agreement about how you're going to share your lunch money with me." Well, no, bullies need to stop it and leave the lunch money to the kid who just got punched in the nose. So that's one kind of accord. That's not what Kevin Warsh means. I wish it were, but that's not. The second kind of accord is the reciprocal, and that is where the Fed has acted with inappropriate disregard of the political process. And as I mentioned, in 1950 and 51, we didn't have that, but we should have. Mariner Eccles should not have been commenting on war policy. And we've got lots of instances in the Fed's history where Fed chairs and other Fed principals have veered too far into the political process. The one that I mentioned in the essay is in 2020 and 2021, Neil Kashkari, the president of the Minneapolis Fed, then as now, launched this very strange foray into Minnesota state politics that really got him locking horns with people in Minnesota because he was promoting a constitutional amendment that would guarantee equality of outcomes in Minnesota education. And it was all over the Minneapolis Fed's website. The Federal Reserve was invoked constantly on this campaign. I think it was a very big distraction for Kashkari himself as he was promoting it. And he would justify it because, the macroeconomic consequences of inequality of education and systemic racism and things like that are profound. Well, maybe that's true, but that doesn't mean that that's the Fed's business. So in 2022, the Federal Reserve, the board, issued a mandate to the reserve banks that they all must adopt a code of conduct. And the code of conduct they all adopted was uniform. So you can still look this up. You can look this up right now. And in section 4.3 of that code of conduct, it says Federal Reserve Bank employees are not allowed to use bank resources or bank influence to support referendums and constitutional amendments. So you can call this the Kashkari Amendment. You're not allowed to do that, or he wouldn't be allowed to do
Yeah.
that. And that, I think, is kind of an accord. It's a saying, hey, the Fed screwed up. Neil Kashkari should never have been the face of this constitutional amendment, and we won't do it again. And I think that there have been a few instances where that's appropriate. The question is, do we need that now? And I don't see it. I think the accusation that the Fed in 2026 is woke or is left-wing or is right-wing or is too partisan, it doesn't stick. I don't think that makes sense. And I don't think it makes sense. Some people would say, but just look at supervision regulation. It's like, look, that's different. I think that should be political. I think that the fact that Vice Chair Bowman is doing things that are much more sympathetic to Republican conceptions of risk, innovation, stability is completely appropriate. And the fact that Barr wanted to do things that were much more sympathetic to a democratic worldview, very appropriate. So we're really talking about a monetary accord here. And so I think the accusations that have been levied against the Fed by the Trump administration and people like Scott Bessent and people like Kevin Warsh are just factually inaccurate. And so that doesn't seem to be a good reason for an accord because we need the Fed to get out of politics. I just don't see it there.
Hey, Peter, just to highlight another example, you have brought up also Alan Greenspan's involvement in Social Security. So we gave kind of an example from the left. Let's do one from the right.
Yeah.
What was he doing that was inappropriate?
Yeah, I wrote about this another time. Alan Greenspan, let me start with the end. So, one of his last acts as Fed chair, he resigned in 2006, was he was writing op-eds, testifying before Congress, and using influence behind the scenes to promote the privatization of Social Security. And he was doing so as Fed chair. He never should have done that. Totally inappropriate. And it was really an asterisk on his chairmanship. He was a dazzling central banker in many respects. And his record of effective monetary policy, especially in the 90s, his handling of the 87 crisis, his handling of 2001, 9/11, really extraordinary. But he let politics get the better of him. This wasn't the only time that he did it, but it was the most egregious. And if the Fed had announced in 2006 when Ben Bernanke came on board, and to be honest, Ben Bernanke was very mindful of this. This is before the crisis. And while he didn't state this outright publicly to repudiate what Greenspan had done, he walked way back from that kind of political engagement, which is ironic, of course, because he was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under George W. Bush, but he was much less partisan than Alan Greenspan. So that would have been an example. What if Bernanke had called up Hank Paulson and said, "Hey, we need to have an agreement. You're never going to ask me to comment on political stuff, and I'm never going to do that. And let's write a letter that says the Federal Reserve System and the Treasury Department have reached an accord regarding comments on political matters outside of monetary policy." That would have been a great accord. I would have supported that, and that would have been important to do. And that essentially did happen, but it was more behind the scenes.
All right. So we've gone through two possible accords, and you said neither of them really are what one could do. The first one was really getting politics or Treasury out of monetary policy. And then second, kind of flipping that, getting the Fed out of politics. So what's the third option?
Well, this is the one that I like the most, and this is what I hope that worse means. But accord is too grandiose a label for this, and that is to say, we find ourselves in a position where the Fed, in the pursuit of its monetary policy, and the Treasury, in pursuit of fiscal policy, have created frictions and tensions that need to be resolved. And the resolutions of those frictions and tensions might require the Fed changing its monetary policy regime, or it might require the Treasury to behave in ways that they might not otherwise prefer in support of more orderly functionality in the public debt markets. Now, that kind of conversation has happened many, many, many times in the Fed's history. In fact, it's part of an ongoing conversation in small ways and large. So are we in a position now where having conversations about the size of the Fed's balance sheet are relevant to the orderly functionality of public debt markets? I mean, yeah, we are. Is it appropriate to shrink the Fed's balance sheet? Do we need to expand it in times of crisis? Do we need to have a better understanding of how that works? Do we need to have a better understanding of where on the yield curve the Fed should participate most? We've been spending most of our time in bills since 1951, so-called bills-only transition. Do we need to extend the maturity of government debt? Should we be thinking about that in different ways? Are there ways that we can think about Fed support of public debt markets that will not infringe on Fed independence to set interest rates? Well, the answer to all those questions are maybe. And should the Treasury and the Fed sit down together to think through how their institutional roles to support public debt markets should reinforce each other rather than work at loggerheads? They 100% should do this. So, do you want to call that an accord? I can see for political reasons why that would be nice. Talking about a Fed Treasury accord sounds like a really important idea from really important people who understand really important policy. What I don't like about this is I don't want calls for a new accord to validate the smear campaign. I don't want it to validate the use of lawfare, where Donald Trump threatens criminal investigation or launches criminal investigation against Jay Powell, or threatens criminal action against Lisa Cook for mortgage fraud, or just hammers away at the Fed's legitimacy. If the accord for thinking about how the Fed and Treasury should mutually manage public debt comes because the bully has punched the wimp in the nose and stolen his lunch money, I'm out. I think that's not the right name for it, and I think we should characterize it differently. But if Kevin Warsh wants to say, as he has said for a long time, this balance sheet causes a lot of harm, it does something important. It's important to recognize the ample reserve system, that part of expanding the balance sheet, and then the overhang from the GFC and COVID, that part of the balance sheet. There were important reasons why we got to where we are, but we need to transition away from this. And here's how I want to do it, and here's how I think we should think about it. And that's going to require really close collaboration with the Treasury as we move forward. Well, I'm all in on that. I think that's a really healthy form of both for both the Treasury and the Fed to understand their institutional roles in this vital provision of economic policy. But you know what it has nothing to do with? Accountability and independence. And it has nothing to do with those first two kinds of accords. This is a totally different beast. And I think that's where our attention should be. But we shouldn't link them. We shouldn't link it back to, you know what, Donald Trump, you may not like his style, but he sure does have a point. We need to shrink the balance sheet. Total non sequitur. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump and his assault on the Fed. We need to have a separate conversation about coordination around public debt management that separates itself from the politicization of the Fed.
Yeah, and just to make this concrete, since I've thrown some ideas out there in my own writings about this. So in my mind, like two examples of this might be the Fed and the Treasury doing an asset swap. So the Treasury could issue a bunch of new T-bills, excuse me, take those T-bills and swap them for the Fed's Treasury bonds. So then the net debt does not go up. So no debt ceiling issues. but have the Fed sitting on a bunch of Treasury bills, easier to run off, easier to handle, and put the Treasury bonds at the Treasury. Another one might be a way to better manage the TGA or the Treasury General account. So there's been proposals from Bill Nelson, Annette Bissig Jorgensen, that would it probably need some buy-in from the Treasury. And if you want to even be more radical than those proposals, you may be going back to what they had before 2008 when Treasury parked most of its funds in private banks outside the Fed. And now we're parked inside the Fed. So there's, I think, many margins and or areas where there could be some discussions and lead to some more robust public debt management. But those are distinct, is what you're saying, from the first two conversations.
Yeah, I think those conversations are so fascinating. I'm not even sure where I would come out on those. I'm easily persuaded by you. I don't know what that says about our relationship, David. But yeah, I mean that sounds really important, really interesting. And there's a big Brookings paper out from my PhD student Chris Hughes and his co-author Josh Younger, who's been on the podcast before. Um, Super interesting about basically the wealth transfer under the ample reserves framework. And whether it creates an arbitrage for banks who are paying an average still of 0.9% on deposits, but getting the policy rate through their reserves. So, Don Cohn and Bill English really hated the paper. They have a big rebuttal. Those
Yeah.
discussions are so good. They're so good. And they have really important implications for the kinds of things we're talking about, which is the role of Treasury and the role of the Fed in thinking about the rails on which we run monetary policy. And so I think anyone who would quote Fed independence to say that the Treasury should never have anything to say about what's on the Fed's balance sheet is wrong. Full stop. That has nothing to do with Fed independence. Questioning the way that monetary policy is engineered to accomplish goals that make the life of the Treasury harder, that has nothing to do with Fed independence. That's part of the mutual collaboration on the management of public debt that should be part of any functioning central bank. It can become a part of Fed independence if it is used as kind of a weaseling of politicians
Yeah.
to a level of the policy rate or its target. Now that is where we'd get uncomfortable. And that's why we need to delink those conversations. And that's why I think most of the conversations about we need a new accord, I don't like. I'm skeptical of them because I see them as linking a really important, robust discussion and debate between Treasury and Fed about how to manage monetary policy and the smear campaign against the Fed and its credibility.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation, Peter. We have been going longer than I had anticipated. That's because this is so much fun. And thank you to all the people who've joined us. We will also put this video recorded version of it on Substack as well. But Peter, you get the final closing words. What do you want to leave with us today?
You know what I've been thinking about today is I I am so persuaded that the AI revolution that was launched in 2022 and continues to gain momentum may be the single biggest technological change in the history of humanity, bigger than the printing press, bigger than movable type, and bigger than the shipping container or double entry bookkeeping or the internet or personal computer or the transistor. I mean, all these epic making changes. I think AI is going to be bigger. So here's where I would end. As people know who follow my Substack, I write about a lot of different things, not just about banking, but also about personal. And a post that I'm going to put up tomorrow is I think everybody should be asking themselves, what part of my existence is so completely defined by me that it couldn't be replaced by anyone else, including artificial intelligence? And this conversation, which I loved, I think there are parts of it that couldn't be replaced, but a lot of it that could, right? I think
Sobering.
a lot of what I do, like writing this history of the 1951 Accord that I was talking
Yeah.
about earlier, will AI be able to do that better than me one day? Probably. But there are a lot of things that I do as a father, as a husband, as an athlete, and as a thinker about the Fed and about banking that gets reduced to my essence, kind of my soul.
Mhm.
And I think that
Yeah.
wherever anyone is on any kind of religious parameter or anything else like that, I think that's a really important question for us to be asking ourselves in the midst of this AI revolution. What's my soul? Like what's the nub
Absolutely.
of who I am and my
Mhm.
contribution to the world? Because I think all of us has something, and I think it's worth discovering.
Yeah, last night I was in Reagan National Airport, Peter. So I was in DC all this week. In fact, I'm recording this from home, but let me read a picture of an image of a T-shirt. So I was sitting eating my vegetarian hamburger at this hamburger joint at Reagan National. Been a long week, and I did a bunch of meetings and recordings. But this lady on the back of her T-shirt, she had this statement. She says, "Dear person behind me, the world is a better place with you in it." And I love that statement. Now, whoever walks behind her saw. I was blessed by that, and this goes to your point. Who are we at the deepest level? Our soul, and I think we're all here for a reason. We're all here to make a difference, and if anything, AI shows us how much more important it is for us to interact with fellow humans, and that importance of the personal touch and just getting to know each other, having chats like this, going to conference. I think going to conferences are even more important than ever before, just to be with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely co-sign that, David.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, watchers. And we'll do this again sometime in the future. Ciao.